Logan Reid, a cold-hearted millionaire who only trusts numbers, unexpectedly meets a little girl saving part of her breakfast for her sick grandmother. He doesn't realize that this brief encounter will pull him into a journey that upends everything. An unearthed past, a woman who once vanished, and a family he never dared to dream of. The early morning sunlight poured over the gleaming glass streets of downtown Los Angeles, reflecting off the towering buildings' glass walls like a flamboyant greeting reserved for the successful. In the quiet stillness of a Saturday morning, a man sat in the corner of a small coffee shop called Maple and Brew, a place few would expect a millionaire to visit. Logan Reid, 34, dubbed the cold brain of Silicon Valley, was intently focused on the tablet in his hands, its screen filled with dense financial charts and lines of code. He wore a light gray tailored coat, stitched to perfection down to the last thread, his gray-blue eyes unwavering as he reviewed data for an upcoming shareholders' meeting. On his wrist, a Patek Philippe watch gleamed with a steely sheen, marking time with precision, just like his life. Perfect, controlled, never missing a beat. "Black coffee as usual, Mr. Reid." The gentle voice of the barista, Lily, pulled him back to reality. He nodded, eyes still fixed on the screen. "Thank you," he said, before sinking back into his world of numbers. For Logan, Saturday was no different from Monday. No days off, no family, no lazy mornings with loved ones. His success didn't come from luck. It came from iron discipline and a closed-off heart. And then that changed, all because of a voice softer than a breeze. "If I eat less, there might still be enough for Grandma." Logan looked up. The voice was so faint, yet it pierced through his thick armor in a strange way. He scanned the room for its source and spotted a little girl, about 6 years old, sitting alone on the concrete steps outside the shop, clutching a tiny box of scrambled eggs. She wore a faded yellow dress, her brown hair messy and wild, her large round eyes staring at the food as if it were treasure, not with greed, but with a serious, cautious calculation. Unusual for a child. Logan frowned. He glanced back at his tablet. Everything was still there, the numbers, the strategies, the shares, but something in him couldn't return to normal. For the first time in years, he closed the device. He stood up, and the cold millionaire of the financial world, walked toward the girl. "Hey, kid," he said a little awkwardly. "Are you here by yourself?" The girl looked up, wary but unafraid. "Yes, my grandma's sick. I went to get breakfast. She said not to take anything from strangers." Logan let out a small chuckle. "Your grandma's very smart, but I've introduced myself now. I'm Logan." The girl paused, then answered seriously. "I'm Sophie." A silence followed. Logan didn't know what to say next. He glanced at the eggs in her hands and asked softly, "Does eating so little fill you up?" Sophie looked down, her eyes dimming slightly. "No, but Grandma needs it more than I do." Logan felt something tighten in his chest. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't pity. It was a soft jolt, like a breeze blowing through a door that had been locked for too long. Without thinking, he asked, "Would you like to eat a little more, or take something extra for your grandma?" Sophie stared at him. For a long time, her eyes seemed to weigh not just his offer, but him as a person. Finally, she gave a small nod. "But I have to pick the food. I know what Grandma likes." Logan smiled. A real smile, the first in a long while. "Deal. You're in charge of breakfast. I'm just the assistant." And so, as the sun climbed to the rooftops across the street, Logan Reid, the millionaire who once thought he had everything, began a journey he never could have foreseen, following a 6-year-old girl in a faded yellow dress to buy breakfast for a grandmother he'd never met. And though he didn't know it yet, from that moment on, his world had changed forever. The eastern alley of the city welcomed them with weathered windows and cracked steps, still damp with morning dew. Sophie walked briskly ahead, her small feet hopping over the pavement's fissures as if it were a familiar game. "Be careful," Logan called after her, not entirely sure if he was worried for her or for himself stepping into an unfamiliar neighborhood. and perhaps a piece of the past he'd tried to bury. "Grandma lives on the 3rd floor," Sophie said without looking back. "The green apartment with flower pots by the window. I can climb the stairs myself, but since you're with me today, it'll be faster." Logan only nodded. He felt he was doing something utterly irrational, following a 6-year-old girl to a stranger's home, all because of a whisper, a portion of scrambled eggs, and something he hadn't yet named. The wooden staircase creaked with age as they ascended. The 3rd-floor hallway smelled of old paint, jasmine, and something faintly reminiscent of memory. Logan's heart tightened for reasons he couldn't grasp. Sophie stopped in front of a chipped green door. She knocked lightly 3 times. "Grandma, I'm back, and I brought a new friend." The sound of a latch clicked. Then slowly the door opened, and time seemed to freeze. The woman before him was thinner, her hair grayer, but those eyes were unmistakable. "Helen?" Logan blurted out, almost a whisper. His entire body felt rooted to the spot. The woman stood still, her hand gripping the doorframe. Her eyes widened, unable to believe what stood before her. "Logan?" she gasped, as if summoning a dream that had slept too long. That moment, just a few seconds, brought 20 years back to life. Sophie glanced between them, her eyes wide. "Grandma? You know him?" Helen nodded faintly, her trembling hand clutching the edge of the door. Her voice seemed to echo from a distant place. "I took care of Logan back when I worked at the orphanage. He was just a boy then, with very sad eyes." Logan swallowed hard. Memories he thought had faded surged back. A small room painted pale yellow, the smell of pancakes on Sunday mornings, and a gentle hand that once patted his head when nightmares came. She had been the only home he'd ever known. "I thought you left without a word," Logan said, his voice thick with emotion. Helen closed her eyes for a moment, then opened them, her gaze a mix of joy, guilt, and something like repentance. "They gave me 1 day to leave," she whispered. "Budget cuts. And they wouldn't let me say goodbye to the kids. They said it would hurt you all more. Not saying goodbye hurt anyway," Logan replied, his voice soft but sharp like a blade. Inside the small apartment, sunlight filtered through the curtains. Logan stepped in at her invitation. The space was simple, with a faint scent of cinnamon, hand-embroidered tablecloths, and walls covered in children's drawings. "I drew those," Sophie boasted. "That one's Grandma and that one an elephant-shaped pancake. She makes them so good." Helen smiled, but her eyes never left Logan. "You've grown so much," she said, her voice breaking in fragments. "And it seems you've achieved more than I ever dared dream for you." Logan looked around the room. Everything was old, but tidy and warm. He suddenly realized this place had a soul. It had love. It had something his multi-million-dollar penthouse could never possess. A long breath rose in his chest. Not exhaustion, but release. He looked at her. "I think we still have a lot left to say." Helen nodded. "And there's still time if you want." In the corner of the room, Sophie was setting out freshly bought bread rolls on the table, humming a little tune about sunshine and wind. An innocent child, an old woman who had once been a mother to parentless children, and a man who thought he'd lost the feeling of family. This strange little universe had just been reconnected, all because of a whisper that morning. The next morning, Logan didn't go to the office as usual. Instead of sitting in the 43rd floor boardroom with financial reports and expansion strategies, he found himself perched on a creaky wooden chair in Helen's tiny kitchen, breathing in the warm scent of slightly burnt pancakes. Beside him, Sophie wore an oversized polka-dot apron, eagerly scooping pancake batter onto a hot griddle. "Grandma, your elephant pancakes are rounder than mine," Sophie said with a frown. "You just need more practice," Helen replied gently. "You're only 6. Pancakes need love. They don't need to be perfect." Logan smiled. He'd never heard anyone talk about food like that, needing love. To him, everything in life was an equation. Investment equals outcome. But here, in this small kitchen, it seemed love could live in the tiniest things, like a pancake with banana ears and raisin eyes. When Sophie stepped out to the balcony to tend to the flower pots, Logan turned to Helen. "I don't remember the last time I had breakfast with someone," he admitted. "Maybe at St. Anne's. Maybe the last time you made pancakes for us." Helen smiled, but a faint mist clouded her eyes. "You liked robot-shaped pancakes back then. I remember." Logan chuckled. "I thought you'd forgotten everything. The kids there, I could never forget any of them, even if no one remembers me." In that moment, the kitchen seemed to shrink, leaving just two souls quietly reconnecting after 20 years apart. Logan lowered his voice. "How are you getting by, Helen?" "I do odd jobs for small parties, sell flowers on weekends. It's enough to manage while I'm not too frail." Logan fell silent. He didn't know who to be angry at, the system, life, or himself, for being so consumed with climbing higher that he never looked back. He glanced around the kitchen, the smell of pancakes, the sunlight, Sophie's chatter drifting in from the window. A question sprang into his mind, sudden and reckless. Why not turn this into something bigger? That thought clung to him all morning, even when he had to return to the office. On the drive back, he didn't check emails or make calls. He drove aimlessly through the eastern streets, stopping in front of a row of old shops. His gaze settled on a faded sign, "Rosemary Café, closed." The windows were dusty, but inside, the kitchen counter, service area, and square wooden tables remained intact. It just lacked warmth. That afternoon, he returned to the small apartment. Sophie was drawing a thank you card for him because he'd bought too many sandwiches. While Helen washed dishes, Logan stood still for a moment. Then he stepped forward. "I want you to hear a crazy idea." Helen looked up. "The last time someone said that to me, they invited me to Las Vegas." Logan laughed. His second laugh of the day. "No. This is riskier." He told her about the abandoned cafe, its untouched equipment, and how the neighborhood was being revived by artists, coffee shops, and weekend markets. "I don't know how to cook," he said, "but I know how to invest, and I know how you cook." Helen went quiet. "You'd be the chef. I'd provide the capital. You'd run the menu, the service. A small place, not a fancy restaurant, just somewhere that feels like home." Helen set the dishcloth down. "I'm 63 years old, Logan, and I'm raising a 6-year-old. Do you think I still have the strength?" "That's exactly why I need you," Logan said. "No one else can make pancakes that make a kid feel safe, and no one else can make an orphan feel loved." Helen froze. "I don't want charity," she said after a pause. "I'm not offering charity. I'm proposing a partnership to build a place that we and Sophie can call home." Helen glanced at Sophie, the little girl blowing soap bubbles by the window, hands smudged with crayon, her smile radiant. "You know," Logan said softly, "if I did this just for you, it wouldn't be enough. But the truth is, I'm doing this for myself too." Helen looked at him for a long time, and then, for the first time since he'd returned, she smiled. A real warm smile, like the last one he'd seen so long ago in the backyard of that orphanage all those years back. The grand opening of Helen and Sophie's home kitchen fell on a crisp Sunday morning when sunlight gently spilled over the old concrete steps and a soft breeze rustled the young marigold pots by the door. Helen stood in the kitchen, her hands trembling slightly as she fastened the last button on her pristine white chef's coat, her name embroidered in pale blue thread. It had been a long time since she'd been called Chef Helen, not out of pity, but out of respect. Across the counter, Logan was arranging the menus printed on recycled craft paper, simple but heartfelt, just as she'd wanted. Today he wore a rolled-up shirt, no tie, no $1,000,000 watch, no CEO title. Just Logan, a man learning to slow down and live again. Sophie, in a tiny apron printed with elephant-shaped pancakes, was placing flowers on each table, humming a song she'd made up. Pancakes for a new day, with a heart in. Logan watched her, smiling. To him, this restaurant was an investment. It was a homecoming. At 11 a.m., the doorbell chimed. The first customers stepped in, an elderly couple moving slowly, but with bright eyes. "We saw the flyer at the library," they said. "Heard this place makes you feel like you're home." Helen seated them by the window. As she brought out a dish of 3-cheese macaroni with pickled beet salad, she murmured, "This used to be my signature dish at a restaurant that's long gone. Now I'm making it again, because I don't want those flavors to fade with time." The woman clasped her husband's hand, her eyes glistening. "Thank you. The last time we had something like this was our 40th anniversary. That place is gone too." Helen said nothing, just nodded, but the light in her eyes had shifted, as if a buried piece of her past was finally allowed to breathe again. In the first week, they served only 15 tables a day, but word of mouth spread faster than any advertisement. The roast chicken smells like memories. The pancakes are like a lost childhood found again. The littlest server in town is the sweetest. Customers started returning, ordering the same dishes, sitting in the same spots. They brought friends, family, and stories, shared over laughter and tears between bites. For Helen, each day in the kitchen was a revival. She coughed less than before. Her face grew rosier, her steps steadier. Logan had secretly booked her an appointment at the best clinic in the area, but what truly healed her was the feeling of being needed, of living her passion once more. And Logan, he changed more than he even realized. Instead of meeting with investors, he learned to haggle over vegetable prices with local farmers. Instead of analyzing data, he jotted down customer feedback by hand, line by line, thought by thought. He knew the regulars by face, remembered who liked hot tea or iced water, even knew that the silver-held woman at table 4 had lost her husband 3 years ago and still came back to sit in the same chair. He began rewriting his definition of success, not with numbers, but with the satisfied look in an old man's eyes after finishing a bowl of pumpkin soup. Not with profit, but with Sophie's laughter ringing through the kitchen as pancake batter dusted her hair. One late evening after cleanup, Logan lingered in the kitchen. Helen was wiping down the counter with a cloth while Sophie slept on the bench, clutching her stuffed bear. "Are you tired?" he asked. Helen looked up, smiling. "I've never felt this kind of tired. It reminds me I'm still alive." Logan nodded slowly. He didn't say anything, but deep down he knew. From that first pancake, a woman had come back to life. A child had found a home, and a man had learned to love without calculation. Outside, a light rain began to fall. The smell of the kitchen, the hint of cinnamon, and Sophie's steady breathing, they wove together into the gentlest melody he'd ever heard in his life. Late that afternoon, the restaurant was quieter than usual. A sudden downpour had thinned the crowd, leaving only a few patrons, sipping hot tea and chatting in hushed tones. Logan was reviewing the reservation list for the next week when Helen emerged from the kitchen, holding a crumpled cream-colored envelope, her face pale. He knew instantly something was wrong. "What's going on?" he asked, stepping closer. Helen handed him the envelope without a word. Logan opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, penned in careful, slanted script. Beneath it lay a photograph. A young woman with eyes identical to Sophie's. Her gaze so deeply sad it sent a chill down Logan's spine. The letter began with an apology. "I know you won't forgive me easily, but if you're reading this, you haven't torn it up yet, and I'm grateful for that. I left Sophie that day not because I didn't love her, but because I thought it would keep her safe." Helen sank into a chair, hands clasped tightly, trying to stay calm. "That man, Sophie's real father, threatened to kill her if I left him. I had nowhere to go, no lawyer, no one who'd believe me. It was only when he got arrested for something else and locked up that I dared to come back for her." Logan read to the final line, where the woman, Rachel Phillips, Sophie's biological mother, wrote, "If you'll allow it, I'd like to see her again. Not to take her away, just to be present, even if only on the edges of her life. I'll wait outside the restaurant, if you agree." Logan looked up. When did you get this?
Helen
swallowed hard. An hour ago, she left it with Marco, the morning shift waiter. She knows the address? Logan asked, though he already knew the answer. Helen nodded. And she knows about you. Logan clenched his fist. A wave of unease spread through him. Not fear that Rachel would cause harm, but that she might shake the fragile family they'd just built. Rachel arrived at 5:20 p.m. as the last rays of daylight slanted across the storefront. Logan saw her first, a woman in an old coat, hair hastily tied back, her eyes carrying a decade of guilt. She stood outside, not entering, just looking. Sophie was at the far table, coloring a giraffe. "I'll talk to her first," Logan said, and Helen gave a slight nod. He stepped outside. "You're Rachel?" The woman nodded. "You're Logan?" "Yes. I've been here since the day Sophie saved her eggs for her grandma." Rachel gave a faint, strained smile. "That's the only reason I dared to come." Logan met her gaze. "You walked away." "I did," she replied, unflinching, "but not because I didn't love her, because I couldn't protect her. When I left her, with my mother, I cut myself out so she could live. And now you're back because I'm done hiding, because I want Sophie to know that even though I failed, I never stopped loving her. I'm not asking for anything, just to orbit her life, even as a distant satellite." Logan was silent for a long time. "Do you know what you're touching?" he asked. "A happy little girl, a grandmother who's just come back to life after years of exhaustion, a kitchen that's become a home." Rachel nodded faintly. "And I don't want to ruin that. But if Sophie ever asks who I am, I don't want to lie." Helen came out a few minutes later. No embrace, no tears. She just stood before Rachel, her eyes a blend of hurt, anger, and something that had cooled over the years. "I can't forgive you right away," Helen said, "but I'll let Sophie decide." That evening after cleanup, Helen sat by Sophie's bedside. Logan stood at the door, silent. The whale-shaped nightlight cast a warm, gentle glow across the small room. "Sweetheart," Helen began, "someone wants to meet you." "Who?" Sophie asked, sitting up. "Your real mother," she said slowly. "She left once, but now she wants to know you, if you want." Sophie was quiet for a long time. "Does she know about elephant pancakes?" Logan let out a soft laugh. Helen shook her head gently. "Not yet, I don't think." "Then I can teach her," Sophie said, settling back onto her pillow. "But only if she eats the first elephant whole." Helen turned to Logan. He nodded. The storm had come, but this little home, fragile as it was, still stood strong. That Christmas Eve, snow didn't fall in Los Angeles, but in a small corner of the Artisan District, where warm golden lights glowed against the white-painted storefront. Winter seemed to have found its refuge. Helen and Sophie's home kitchen closed earlier than usual. No menus, no bills, no customers, just family, and a special promise. Logan stood in the tidied kitchen, fumbling with a red cloth as he tied a bow around a gift wrapped in brown paper. It was a small baking set Sophie had pointed to in a toy store, her eyes sparkling like stars. Nearby, Helen was checking a cinnamon apple pie in the oven, while Rachel, perhaps for the first time in years, arranged flowers in a ceramic vase on the dining table. "Not a perfect Christmas," Rachel said softly, "but maybe the realest one." Helen glanced at her daughter. "We don't need perfect. We just need people who truly want to stay." Sophie bounded into the room, her red dress shimmering, clutching a teddy bear dressed as Santa Claus. She squealed when she saw the table set, extra chairs pulled up, and her usual spot, with a new chair beside it. "For Rachel?" she asked, her eyes lighting up. Rachel froze. Helen nodded. "Yes, and tonight, you'll sit between your two moms." Sophie looked at Logan as if needing his gaze to confirm it was all real. "And where will you sit?" Logan smiled. "Across from you, to make sure everyone eats their veggie." Laughter broke out, not forced, not staged, real laughter. from a 6-year-old who'd just accepted her world expanding by one more person. Throughout dinner, no one mentioned the past. There were only small, everyday stories. Sophie talked about the sparrows she'd saved after the rain. Helen recalled the first time Rachel baked bread but forgot the yeast. Logan admitted he once thought attachment was a word for the weak. And now? Rachel asked quietly. Logan looked around the room. The hanging lamp Helen had chosen, the tablecloth Sophie had drawn on, the new photo of the three of them taped to the fridge. Now, he said, I think attachment is the only thing worth risking a lifetime to hold on to. After dinner, Sophie dragged everyone to sit around the small Christmas tree in the corner, its twinkling blue and red lights breathing softly in the dark. I have a Christmas wish, she said solemnly. Not for toys. I just want everyone to stay together. No one leaves again. Helen took her granddaughter's hand. Rachel wrapped her arms around both of them. Logan watched the scene, his heart tightening with a feeling both foreign and familiar, the sense of belonging. Before leaving, Rachel paused in front of Logan. Thank you, she said, for not stepping back when I knocked. Logan smiled faintly. I stood in front of a door once, for a long time, afraid I wouldn't be welcomed. I get it. Rachel nodded, her eyes red-rimmed. Hear the bridge, and the reason we dared to step toward each other. Late that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Logan stepped out onto the balcony, alone. He pulled an old photo from his wallet, a snapshot of a Christmas at St. Anne's orphanage. Tiny faces, forced smiles, and in the corner Helen, watching the children, her eyes holding an entire sky. No snow, but there was light, and maybe, this year for the first time in a long while, his Christmas was real. The first morning of the new year, soft sunlight bathed the frost-kissed windows, and Sophie's laughter echoed from the kitchen to the living room like a gentle prelude to a warm beginning. Logan sat at the old wooden table, holding a mug of hot cocoa Sophie had made, overflowing with marshmallows and barely any cocoa. But he drank it all because it held something he'd lacked for years: unconditional love. Helen was reorganizing the spice rack while Rachel sketched a new menu in her notebook. Sophie, still in her unicorn-printed pajamas, was coloring her ideal house, with a garden, a green door, and 4 people standing in front, holding hands. Logan glanced at the drawing and said softly, I just bought a house 4 blocks from here. All 3 women looked up. Sophie was the first to speak, her eyes wide. Does it have a garden? Yes, and a white picket fence, and... Logan paused for a moment. A room big enough to hang all your drawings if you'd like. Helen said nothing. Rachel studied him, as if trying to guess what he hadn't yet put into words. Logan took a breath. I don't know how to start this, but if it's okay, I'd like to be closer. More than just stopping by and leaving. I want to be part of this family, even if there's no clear title for it yet. The room fell silent for a beat, then Sophie launched herself at him, wrapping her arms around him tightly, whispering as if afraid the wind might steal her words. So you'll never leave again, right? Logan hugged her back, his eyes stinging. I'm staying, kiddo. If you still want me to. Helen stepped forward, resting a gentle hand on his shoulder. We lost each other once, Logan. But this time, if we hold on together, we can call this place home. Outside, sunlight spilled golden onto the porch, and in that small kitchen, a family was born. Not by blood, but by choice. A choice warmer than anything Logan had ever known.